she flies so.
Turn the music down. Good evening. I'd like to call to order tonight's meeting, our tax rate hearing, and please join me for the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Roll call, Mrs. Calander.
Mrs. Applebaum? Mr. Applebaum?
Here.
Mr. Jacob?
Here.
Mr. Major?
Present.
Mrs. Mogerman?
Present.
Dr. Sturtino? Mr. Feldman?
Here. 3.0, I don't believe there are any citizen statements for the tax rate hearing. 4.0, call for executive session. There is none. 5.0, approval of the agenda. May I have a motion and a second to approve the agenda, September 19th, 2012.
So moved.
Second.
Do we need a roll call, Carol?
No.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries 6-0. 6.0, items for review and or action. 6.01, hearing on the proposed 2012-2013 tax rate. Call on Mr. Mark Stockwell, our CFO.
President Feldman, members of the board, Dr. Marty, Ms. Kalanda. Tonight, we're holding the public hearing for the proposed property tax rates.
I'm not sure that your microphone's on. Okay.
Tonight, we're holding a public hearing for the proposed property tax rates for the current school year. The purpose of the meeting is to discuss those proposed rates in a public forum, but also to provide an opportunity for public comment on those rates before you act on them later on in the regular board meeting. We're also going to talk a little bit about the reestablishment of tax rate ceilings, which I'll explain in a minute, the current assessed values, the proposed rates, the impact of the proposed rates on an average homeowner, the impact on the district budget, and then the voluntary rollback that we've had in place for several years. And then I'll open the floor to any questions from the community and then also from the board. Since 2007, Parkway's voluntarily levied tax rates that were below the voter-approved maximums or ceilings. In order to maintain this unused taxing authority, the Board of Education must vote to eliminate the voluntary rollback and revert back to the legal ceilings each non-reassessment year. And the non-reassessment years are the even-numbered years. A recommendation is included in the consent agenda later this evening that eliminates this voluntary rollback and reverts back to the legal ceilings. Those ceilings, proposed ceilings, are residential, it's $3.84.8. Commercial is $4.15.06. Agriculture is $5.12. Personal property is $3.73.79. These ceilings then essentially serve as a starting point in the 2012 operating rate calculations. The proposed rates to be levied will be presented later on in my presentation, and then you'll also be asked to vote on those proposed rates later on in the meeting in an action item. But before we actually get into the rates that we're going to ask you to levy tonight, I wanted to talk a little bit about the current assessed valuation and how it compares to last year. Current assessed valuation is $4.25 billion. That's an increase of about $5 million from last year, and it's about a 0.12% increase. Residential increased about $530,000. Commercial went down about $8.6 million. A pleasant surprise was that personal property actually increased a little over $13 million. Personal property has basically been declining over the past decade as the economy kind of hit, but also because they changed the law a few years ago that accelerated the depreciation of personal property once they put it on the tax rolls. So we went from over $600 million in personal property a few years ago down to 531 right now. So that was good news. Agricultural stayed basically the same. When you look at these changes, we did have $6.7 million in new construction in residential, $3.2 in commercial. I mentioned the personal property, but we also had reductions in our assessed values due to successful assessment appeals by businesses and by residents. Commercial went down $11.9 million through appeals. Residential went down $6.2 million. And again, you had the small increase in agricultural. Total assessed valuation, again, is $4.25 billion. Commercial is about 25% of that. Residential is 62.5%. Personal property is about 12.5%. And before I actually go too much into the rates for next year, I just wanted to point out that property tax rates are set and collected by property class. And when I say property class, I mean residential, commercial, agricultural, and personal property. Once the property taxes are collected, we then allocate those funds to the various funds that we operate, and we do that by setting what we call a blended rate. And the blended rate allocates money to the general fund, the special revenue or the teachers fund, the debt service fund, or the capital projects fund. The proposed rates for 2012 are residential. It's 3.5961. That's a 26-cent increase from last year. We're able to propose that because we have been levying a rate that was significantly below the voter-approved ceilings for the past 5 years. The commercial rate is going up 16.55 cents to $4.21.15. Again, that's part of a voluntary rollback, but that also includes 1 penny, 1.77 cents. That's attributable. It's caused by a recoupment of commercial property taxes that were returned to taxpayers for appeals that were settled this year, but some of the appeals actually dated back to 2003. So we actually returned over $3 million last year, and unfortunately, we're just the way the tax laws work, we're only going to be able to really recoup about $180,000 of that. But the personal property tax rate will be staying the same, and the agricultural rate goes down 2/100ths of a cent, so it essentially stays the same. The blended rate of 3.7678 is 20.32 cents higher than last year, and these rates exclude the 34-cent debt service levy. We then take the monies again and allocate them out by fund, and these are the rates that are provided by fund: $1.26 to the general fund, $2.50 to the special revenue fund, and those I'm actually not recommending any allocation for the capital improvement fund, as we had built up some reserves in that fund, enough to cover us for a couple years. So 2 or 3 years from now, we'll have to start levying in the capital projects fund again. But those three combined represent the operating tax rate, and then we also add on to that the debt service levy for a total blended rate of $4.10, 10.78 cents. And the proposed rates, I wanted to also just provide an example of how it would impact an average homeowner in Parkway. Last year, if you had a home that was valued at $250,000 and you had vehicles or boats valued at $15,000, your assessed valuation would have been, your market value would have been $265,000. Your assessed valuation, which is a percentage of your market value, would have been $52,450. When you apply the residential and the personal property tax rates to those two categories, you would have paid $1,983 to Parkway last year. This year, with the new rates, I left the home the same because this was not a reassessment year. The cars I increased by $378, only because the personal property total went up, the 2.52%. If you didn't buy a new car, your value would actually have gone down through the depreciation, but I thought it was fair to add that. Bottom line is your taxes this year to Parkway would be $2,112. That's a $129 increase. And I also wanted to point out that our share of the property taxes, Parkway's, represents between 50 and 55% of your total property tax bill. When I made this presentation last year, I had a few comments from folks thought that I was saying that was their entire property tax bill. It's a little over half. So then when we look at projected property taxes compared to last year, total property taxes, which include the debt service levy, last year were $161 million. This year, we're projecting $169.5 million. That's about an $8.5 million increase, or 5.29%. When we look at operating revenues, again, that excludes the debt service piece, we collected $147 million last year. The proposed taxes for this year are $155.5. Again, it's right at $8.5 million, and that's a 5.78% increase. When you compare what we're projecting now with what was originally budgeted, 153.1 was budgeted, 155.5 is what we're projecting. That's about a $2.3 million positive variance. That's a 1.55%. That's tied to the voluntary rollback adjustment and the fact that our personal property came in a little higher than what we had projected. One of the things I wanted to also point out is that last year, 2011, our tax rate, residential operating tax rate, was 19th out of 22 school districts, meaning it was the 4th lowest in St. Louis County. With the adjustment this year, it will still be 19th out of 22 school districts. So I just wanted to point out we're still very near the bottom as far as tax rates are. And then finally, we, like I said, mentioned earlier, since 2007, we've been levying a tax rate. Last year was 52 cents below the authorized ceiling. This year it's 25.77 cents below the authorized ceiling. And basically that would, if you levied the full amount, it would generate an additional $6.8 million annually. And at this point, I wanted to open the floor to any questions or comments that may come from anyone in the audience. Okay, thank you. And then, does the board have any questions or comments?
Go ahead.
Mark, I think just the one comment I wanted to make was in terms of equity, we had a pretty significant plan last year to cut expenses where we could and came up with a pretty good plan. And I think one of the reasons we're voting for this is that in terms of equity, $8 million that we reduced our expenses, and then $8 million here so that we could close the hole that we have and not have to reduce programs any further or get into the point where we'd be reducing that. So my message is next year when we meet, I really want to make sure that we have, I know the taxes are going to go up. I want to make sure that the expenses match that.
Absolutely.
I agree.
Okay, anybody else?
We know this was hard to get together today. It was a long late afternoon for you because you didn't get the response you needed from the state. Is that correct? And it's
Yes, the state auditor's office actually reviews the calculations for accuracy before we present them, and they were buried this year, so they didn't get back with me until 4:30. So
and I'm sure it's frustrating because we all know, is it October 1st, the deadline that we have to have this done? So, but we all appreciate your dedication and your hard work to getting this to us tonight.
Thank you.
And I think we spoke about perhaps next year planning our meetings a little bit differently so we can have our regular September board meeting on the second Wednesday like we do every other month, and then perhaps holding at the very end of the month after we're sure you will have your numbers, just a special tax rate hearing. Kind of alleviated some of your stress.
Right. Thank you.
And ours, right. Right, but more yours than ours.
Yeah.
All right, anybody else? Dr. Marty?
I guess,
Well, go ahead.
okay, just on the recoupment issue, and is that a change from how we've been able to handle that sort of topic before, or is this a new?
This was a unique
new
year.
beast.
In the past, we have recouped a couple times, but essentially it's been from a single incident or an instance where the county or the state tax commission have returned a lot of taxes all at one time. What we've seen the past year is that my understanding is that there's been this huge backlog of old appeals that have been to the state tax commission, and again, they date back to 2003. And my understanding is that essentially the state tax commission told the St. Louis County assessor, you need to get with these businesses and settle some of these things, because if we have to deal with these thousands of appeals, you're probably not going to like the way they're handled. I mean, they're going to get handled quickly, and so St. Louis County Assessor's been settling a lot of these old cases, and essentially they're returning millions of dollars in property taxes, which essentially caused last year's property taxes, our collections, to be down. You know, I get the impression that this potentially could continue for a year or two or three as they work through this huge backlog of old appeals. So it was a very interesting process, and it was complicated a little bit this year because we have this voluntary rollback, and that's kind of unusual.
All right, but we do have an elected county assessor now, so I'm sure he's happy to hear from county voters on topics exactly like this if anybody would care to pick up a phone. Is that fair to state?
Yes, but I will say he has been working with us and worked very hard to provide us the information to allow us to try to recoup.
Okay.
There are other districts that are going to be able to recoup some monies because they don't have the voluntary rollbacks. So,
Thank you.
thank you.
Morning.
I just want to say that Mark has worked hard, and so have a lot of other administrators the last year. This was a difficult budget year, but I feel I want to thank Mr. Jacob for that comment and all the board members for your support through the year. I think we're at a good point, a better point than we were a year ago. And I will tell the board and the public that within the week we're going to start looking at the 13-14 budget. So we're not going to give Mark too much of a break here because we really think while we've closed most of the gap, we're going to continue to be very, very conscious about the district's operations and how we are trying to meet our obligations to Project Parkway, but within the confines of a balanced budget and really maintaining fund balance. So we've made great progress, a little more work to do, but we accept the challenge of Chris, your comment about really trying to make sure we're really being conscious year to year. We're very fortunate to have Mark in the district, who was a tremendous watchdog of and very knowledgeable. And I also want to thank all our administrators for their hard work in really preparing our budget and getting to this point.
And the irresponsible thing for us to do would be right now to just raise it up to our ceiling, I think. We could have done that after Prop R, to be quite honest, but we chose to be more careful with that, and I think we just need to continue to be careful.
Well, it was a nice balance between, as Chris said, making the appropriate reductions
Right.
and then looking at how we could use revenue. I've told the administrators perhaps there's lessons in this for other government agencies or entities like our federal government to do a fair amount of revenue increases, but also reductions. I think it's a balance. It's not one or the other, and I really appreciate the fact we were able to do that at Parkway this past year.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. 7.0, call for special meeting, none. 8.0, call for future executive session, none. 9.0, we're going to recess at this time until our 7:30 general meeting. No executive session. 11.0, we are adjourned.